Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, for the last 6 years, we have heard of Deepwater Horizon, the disaster. Now there is a movie by the same name. We'll examine the fact versus fiction. That there is tension between the governor and the state's attorney general is no fiction. We'll examine why. And we will take a special look at education, including new governance in Orleans Parish, UNO's recovery plan for declining enrollment, and in this, a presidential election year, the American ignorance of civics. We'll also look at the career of the late Gary Esolen and his impact on local journalism. In the cast for us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4, Ruth Wilson, education columnist, New Orleans Magazine, and Richard Thompson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. We're going to go over to David first and sort of talk about the relationship between our governor, John Bel Edwards, and our state attorney general, Jeff Landry. There seems to be no love lost there.
Yeah, well, you know, Attorney General Landry, a lot of people are thinking, is going to try to run against the governor in the next election cycle. And they were initially going to be working together on an issue that would seem to put them at odds, which is the coastal land loss lawsuits against oil and gas companies because of their differences of political party and because of their historical take on these issues. Jeff Landry, when he was in Congress, was very outspoken in favor of the oil and gas industry after the oil spill, and in terms of compensation for people affected by the spill and regulations of offshore activity. The thought was that he was going to try to block these suits from happening, but instead he joined in lawsuits that were filed by the various coastal parishes, 4 of them now to date. So then after that, the governor's office joined in the lawsuits. But the problem there was the Department of Natural Resources had already testified that there were no permit violations causing land loss by the oil and gas companies. And so the position of the governor, who had changed, you know, from Bobby Jindal to John Bel Edwards, was in a tough spot because now he had to argue the opposite of what the state had been arguing before. So you have the situation where they're kind of fighting for control over these lawsuits and what the state's position is going to be. And you know, that all kind of came to a head when the governor hired a team of attorneys headed by Taylor Townsend of Natchitoches, who is the head of his super PAC. So there were allegations of cronyism. A lot of the attorneys on that team also gave large sums of money to get him elected. Jeff Landry stood in the way of them getting that contract, saying that the contract was not confected properly, that there were problems with the way they were supposed to be paid in a kind of contingency fee type situation. And now this week, the governor has kind of doubled down, said, not only am I supporting these lawsuits going forward, I want every single coastal parish to sue the oil and gas industry over land loss caused by, in part, by the oil and gas industry.
So these lawsuits are continuing to move on, even though in Jefferson Parish, wasn't there a ruling against that one?
There was a ruling by a Jefferson Parish judge that there was no standing for the lawsuit. It was premature because the Department of Natural Resources had not taken administrative action, and that goes back to this old issue. When Governor Bobby Jindal was in office, the DNR said, we don't see any problems. So then the parishes say, well, we better take an action on our own if we feel like we were damaged by the oil and gas industry. And now there's a different governor, and that governor's Department of Natural Resources says, yes, we want to say that there are damages caused by the oil and gas industry.
So where are we now with this? Who's going to resolve this?
Well, it's interesting because the Attorney General still has to sign off on things moving forward, and instead of working together like they were earlier in the year, it looks like they're absolutely not working together, and that's going to mean whether they can move forward with the lawsuits that Governor Edwards wants to pursue is still up for a question, and we'll see what the Attorney General does.
And of course, the legal issue, hasn't there always been concern by some factions that if you go after the loss, if you go after the oil companies, they're going to just pull and invest in Louisiana anymore.
Well, think about what happened in Plaquemines Parish, that almost the entire council changed over because of a concern about lawsuits and a push for stop the lawsuits against the oil and gas industry, because we depend so much on the oil and gas industry for our local economy.
Of course, Jeff Landry, Republican, John Bel Edwards, Democrat. As you say, there's talk that maybe Jeff Landry is going to seek to unseat John Bel Edwards next go round for the elections, governor elections. But they've been at loggerheads also regarding the funding for the Attorney General's office.
Right.
And basically the legislators just recently said, y'all work it out. We're not going to.
Right. I mean, the Attorney General wanted to have his funding separately, and you know, the governor has taken the position that this is something that should be controlled as a part of the executive branch. And now the legislators are saying, you know, we're not going to make this decision. You guys have to work it out. And
then there was further disagreement between Landry and Bel Edwards, too, regarding the transgender legislation. I mean, didn't Jeff Landry join in a lawsuit with other states and didn't tell the governor that he was doing that?
I don't actually know what the communication was ahead of time, but that is the position that he took. And obviously, they're on opposite sides of that
fence on that one as well.
Yeah,
okay,
right.
Well, we see. That's just part of interesting Louisiana politics.
Yeah,
that's
and
for sure.
setting up for a real kind of battle royale if they do go against each other in the next governor race.
Meanwhile, the pressing issue is, of course, these lawsuits.
Right.
Okay. All right, David. Thanks a lot. Let's go over to Dawn now, and we now have a unification plan for the Orleans Parish Public Schools. Schools that have been on RSD are going to be moving back over to Orleans Parish Public Schools. Why don't you tell us how that's working out?
Well, the school board just approved the transition plan, the planning process of it in August. I guess in some ways the easy part has been done. The hard part is implementing that plan and getting ready for the actual unification, which is supposed to be January the 1st, 2018. So that's a little bit less than 2 years away, and there's a lot to do. The plan was about 71, 72 pages long, so it was very detailed, and it discusses a lot of things that need to be done, and there's been a huge amount of community input on this, and there will continue to be so. It's a huge task ahead, actually, when you think that 49 RSD schools are going to be 49 schools will be going into the school board system. So overall, there'll be about 80 schools that the school board has to manage, and it's used to managing about 30 at the most, less than that, and 33,000 more students coming into the plan. 50 facilities that the school board's going to have to manage and maintain. So it's a very large task, and it's going to take hiring some more people in the central office.
It's going to take money, too. I think the budget is going to be somewhere around $28 million to bring this fold back. And, of course, Orleans Parish Public Schools had been an entity, a system, and then after the storm, the RSD took over a lot of the schools, failing schools. In this past legislative session, it was agreed to that the schools would reunify, which a large segment of the public wanted to see that happen. But as you said, it's going to take time. And also the charter schools remain. So it's really kind of unique to any other kind of school system, because the charters are autonomous.
The New Orleans system is very unique. I mean, it's one of a kind for the nation. The RSD itself is the only all-charter district in the nation. Now, that won't be the case when the unification takes place, because the school board has 6 direct-run schools. Now, that number of direct-run schools could increase over time. What's not really clear is whether the superintendent, who has great authority over this system, will decide to, when new schools are opened, which of course will happen, whether those schools will be charters also, or whether or not he'll be opening them as direct-run schools that he's in charge of. The transition plan doesn't really say anything about that. It's very much stresses the commitment to charter. It stresses the commitment to autonomy and independence for the schools. That the school leaders, even in the direct-run schools, will have control over its budget, its curriculum, its hiring, and so forth. The school district, according to this plan, the superintendent himself will run those 6 direct schools that are there now, just like a charter network would. So there is a very strong commitment to the charter idea, but it doesn't specifically say that any new schools that might be opened in the future would be charters. That's really up to the superintendent to decide.
What happens to the Type 2 charters, or whatever they're called, that are beyond just the Orleans Parish, that have multiple campuses in multiple districts?
Well, I think they're called Type 5s.
Oh, yeah,
The
okay.
ones in the RSD. They come over exactly the same. There's no real change there. They have their contracts, so naturally the contracts have to be honored. Interestingly enough, though, there are many, maybe 24 of them that are coming up for renewal before the unification is supposed to take place. So that's going to require a lot of work too. It's not really clear whether the RSD will be doing that renewal or whether the school board will take over some of those renewals. I would imagine to be the RSD, since the unification hasn't really taken place. There could be a lot of changes even before the unification.
Looking back at the years when the Recovery School District was created in response to Katrina, looking back now, how did it do? Was that a success? Or?
Oh, yes, it was a great success. An amazing success. The recovery has just been astounding. There's a lot of work to do, of course, but in 2005, 80% of the schools were either D or F schools, New Orleans schools, public schools, 80%. Now it's about 26% that are D or F schools. Now that's,
which is
you
still
can
too many,
argue
way too
that's
many.
it's too many, but the progress has just been astounding. And you know, we're only talking about 11 years.
Yeah.
It took the Orleans Parish School Board 3 decades to run them down.
So real quick, yes or no, the charter operator's content with this for the most part? We'll see.
Cautiously
Yeah.
optimistic.
Okay. All right, Don, I'm going to move over to Richard now, but thanks a lot. Richard, talking more education here, University of New Orleans, which is near and dear to my heart, and I know Errol's and Peg's too, Peggy Laborde, we're all alums, but it's really having a hard time, and the enrollment has significantly dropped.
That's right. UNO delivered this week what's become almost regular news for them in the last couple of years, and that their fall enrollment is down again now for the 7th consecutive year. It's down about 5% compared to last year. But UNO's new president, Dr. John Nicklow, I spoke with him. He sees some reasons for optimism. In this case, UNO had a slight uptick in the number of new students, a slight uptick in transfers, and their retention improved a little bit from 62 to 64%. Though, because the retention is already so low, even with those slight gains, they still saw an overall drop.
And that's really an area that he wants to focus on, is retaining students, keeping them in so that they can just continue to go and graduate. So one thing he wants to do, from what I read in your column, was to create a system that really can focus on identifying difficulties that a student might be having in assisting those students.
So rather than try to look at the whole number, for which is just about a little more than 8,000, he wants to break it up into segments, say first-year students, Hispanic students, Black students, and try to improve those numbers just a little bit to try to bring up the overall picture. And so what they're doing is they're looking at analytics to try to see, okay, these students are enrolled in these classes, these recommended classes, the required classes, large, small. They come from this part of the country. They have these attributes or characteristics with other students who are going through that. How have they done to try to gang and see how they'll perform?
And then also branding and marketing in the university. What does he plan to do about
That's
that?
another piece of it as well, is to try to rebrand UNO, to appeal to it, to try to draw on students who, or applicants who are living elsewhere, maybe in colder climates or on the West Coast, who are drawn in at the prospect of living in New Orleans.
So,
You know, for all its years, UNO has faced a lot of difficulties, but no one has ever been able to deny that it's not a good university. I mean, it's always been a good university. People have been able to complain about the lack of college life. I mean, there hasn't been that, but it's you know, it's always been a bargain that offered a good education. Right. So you seem like that there's something marketable there, and you wonder why it lost so much.
I can tell you why.
Okay.
Well, first of all, Katrina, of course, had something to do with it. But around the same time, the entrance standards were increased considerably for all four-year universities, really. And the main thing was the rise of the community college system. There are several community colleges around this area, and many of those students are now going to community colleges for the first 2 years. They might have gone to UNO before. That's a big problem, and there's a new community college starting on the North Shore very soon. So that that drain is going to continue, and going outside of the state and looking for students is probably a very good idea.
But there is going to be an improved transfer system, right, between community colleges, credits to community colleges,
Yes,
2 to 4 years. So that could be a bright side.
It's already pretty easy. That happened a little while ago. The other thing is there's been a really strong focus on technical education all over the country, but particularly in Louisiana in the last 10 years. So many of these students can actually get pretty good jobs with a 2-year degree. It's faster. It doesn't cost as much. And of course, UNO's reputation as being a kind of a tough school. Probably, it's the fact that it's a good school in some cases for the weaker students might be a little bit of a problem.
Well, we
really.
certainly wish the best for UNO, but the new president is really kind of optimistic that he'll be able to bolster that enrollment.
He set a goal of 12,000 students in 5 years, and right now that would be an increase of about 50%.
We hope that he can meet that goal, that's for sure. We certainly support him in that. Thanks a lot, Richard. And now let's go back over now to David. And you did a piece about the Deepwater Horizon movie, which, of course, everybody around here is going to be looking really, really close because we heard so much about it.
Right.
And you really covered that tragic event. And you also uncovered some things about the movie you weren't quite fact.
Yeah, well, I want to first start by saying it's a terrific movie. I went to the premiere here at the Orpheum Theater last week, or this week, and it was very well done. And I commend Peter Berg, the director, for being so dedicated to really showing what goes on offshore. And I've had the pleasure of being on several rigs, and seeing things in real time and how they do the work out there, and they really adhere to that very well. And they did a great job of bringing in a lot of details of what went wrong. But I also spent a lot of, hundreds of hours at these hearings listening to the testimony of what exactly happened, and I felt that there was a responsibility. I really got the feeling for it actually when I was about to go into the showing and I saw Roman Harper, the safety for the Saints. And when this accident happened, or the incident happened, it was right after the Saints had won the Super Bowl, and he was telling me how he really focused on this and he really paid attention and was really concerned about the environmental damage caused by the spill, but that he didn't ever really get a full picture of what happened at ground zero, as he called it. And that's what he wanted to learn from the movie.
Mm-hmm. And do you learn from that?
You do, but you get kind of a skewed picture, and that was the thing that I wanted to try to make sure that people understood, that there was a villainous character portrayed by John Malkovich.
Who does that so well.
Who does it so well, and it's Don Vadrine, who was the BP manager on the rig itself at the time of the explosion. And there's a lot that's very, very specific that's true in his portrayal, but what we found out in trials and testimony is that Don Vadrine was the lowest ranking BP person involved in all of this. And he, to a great extent, was following orders, to a great extent was limited by decisions made in Houston by higher ups. And that's what led to BP being convicted of manslaughter charges. And Mr. Vadrine and his fellow rig site leader, Bob Kaluza, were not convicted of charges that were filed against them by the government. And there were some specific things, a phone call with higher ups in Houston, decisions made to try to save money by the higher-ups in Houston. None of that is included in the movie, and it's all kind of pinned on Mr. Vadrine.
Is there information at all about the fines that BP had to pay, et cetera, anything like that?
That is also curiously left out of the movie. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to literally, make a decision based on what's entertaining, what will move the drama. It's another thing to leave out something that critical from the printed material at the end that tells you what happened. They said that the charges were dropped against Vadrine and Kaluza. They never told you that BP was convicted.
Well, Kaluza actually was acquitted of water pollution charges, essentially, and then Vadrine pled guilty to that and had suspended sentence. That was just resolved, and you covered that, I know, earlier this year.
Correct.
So have you heard from the movie makers about because your criticism was picked up? We went beyond just the New Orleans market.
Right, yeah, the USA Today ran it, and there were a number of stations in our network across the country that used it. And they really didn't, they gave me a statement. The statement was essentially that this honors the heroism of the men and women and the real story of their work on and there were some problems with that too. I pointed out in my story that the person on the bridge, Andrea Fleitas, who jumps off with the Mark Wahlberg character in the movie and the kind of the denouement of the movie and is one of the heroes in the movie, actually testified that she was overwhelmed when the warning lights popped up on her screen and could have hit the alarm a minute to 90 seconds earlier and could have saved people's lives. So there's some issues with the way that they told even the heroism story. But clearly these people displayed great heroism to survive and save some of their colleagues, and that deserves to be told.
So a movie worth seeing overall. Okay, yes. David, thanks a lot. Let's go back over to Don. And presidential race, but for the most part, Americans really don't know their civics.
Unfortunately, they do not. There have been several surveys over the years that have shown that most Americans really do not know how their government operates. There was a survey in 2014 done by the University of Pennsylvania that showed that only about a third of the respondents could identify the three branches of government: legislative, executive, and judicial, and about a third could not identify a single one. This led to some concern, naturally. A organization called Joe Foss, which is a nonprofit, was troubled by this particular study and started a nationwide attempt to get all 50 states to adopt legislation that would require high school students to take the same tests that immigrants have to take for citizenship. So far, only 13 states have done that. Louisiana did. However, the legislation requires high school students to take the test in 2017. But it doesn't require them to pass it, so I'm not really entirely
sure. You just take
sure.
it, but you don't have to pass it. Louisiana students do have to take civics still,
yes,
do they not?
Yes. Most states, as far as I know, probably all 50 of them, require a civics class. Now, what's going on in those civics classes is uncertain. I'm not really... Unfortunately, I think...
It's the old thing about the football coach teaches civics.
Yeah, I think that it gets... and I sort of understand that. Schools are very much pressured now into core subjects, English, math, science. So they probably do have a tendency to not focus on some of those other classes. But for a populace that has to vote for a president and senators and
understand how our government works. Exactly.
It's an alarming trend. The Pew Research Center has also done has a survey on its site where you can take it and see how good you are at current events. That isn't a whole lot better, really. What was really funny, though, is there was a survey done in 2008 that showed only about 49% could answer the very basic questions about government. But about 200 of them said that they were elected officials or had been elected officials, and they scored worse.
That's really, really discouraging. I know somebody who was really concerned about this was former Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and she actually helped start an online civics course called iCivics, which any school could certainly use, and it's very interactive. It's real simple in the beginnings, but it's iCivics.org, I think, if anybody is interested in that.
The American presidential system is very complex, and the thing that I think confuses people is that most of the electing of a president is done by the parties, which narrows everybody down to two people. So the parties have really narrowed it down to two choices. The Constitution doesn't say a word about political parties, yet political parties have such an important role. And the Electoral College just totally baffles people in terms of the election. And I keep telling people that, in effect, our vote's not going to count that much in Louisiana because we're not a significant Electoral College state, and it only counts insofar as tabulating the vote in Louisiana. It's really 50 statewide elections, so it's very confusing.
It is. I know that is confusing. Well, we just all have to read up on our civics, that's for sure.
Just bring back Schoolhouse Rock. That's
right. Okay, Errol, I want to go over to you right now because you did want to mention and talk a little bit about Gary Esolen.
Yeah, the evolution of the alternative newspapers in New Orleans, there was first the paper called the Vieux Carré Courier, and then Figaro, and they kind of like grew up with their baby boomer population, and they all made their mark. They all had trouble surviving financially. And when Figaro was folded, Gary Esolen, who was from New York State, who worked for Figaro, got together with a man named Philip Carter, who put some money into it, and they started Gambit. And Gambit is the one that survived, but it also, as alternatives did around the country, it drifted more toward the mainstream. It wasn't too much worried about the aftermath of the Vietnamese War anymore, as much as worried about zoning issues and budget things, and kind of just moved. It also expanded entertainment coverage. The mainstream news media would never talk about nightclubs, places like Tipitina's. I mean, they would just talk about like the Blue Room. And so they expanded their coverage to a new audience. Gary Esolen was a very articulate man. He had this beautiful, deep voice, and when he said something, I mean, you heard it because he really talked out of a very thoughtful man, and I worked for Gambit for a while, and when they started doing political endorsements, and I always thought that was one of his finest moments, because when Gambit started doing political endorsements, he did really deep, long pieces, not just like short one-paragraph endorsements, and it really, I think, it put the paper kind of in the mainstream, like this is a serious thinker in terms of politics, and so it had its impact as he did. He was a good writer, and one of his favorite themes when he wasn't talking about politics was about the craftsman, the person who works with his hands in the new age of technology, and the juxtaposition between the two of them. He had a brilliant mind, and that mind went into a lot of directions, and after a few years at Gambit, he was thinking a lot about poetry. He was a poet. But I think one of Gambit's finest moments during his time was the positions it took on the whole on utilities issues. And there was a big issue about the regulation of NOPSI, which at the time operated the utilities. And that newspaper really kind of on its own led the crusade in this election to have the regulation of NOPSI returned back to the city council where it used to be.
Well, we should say that Gary passed on this past week, and certainly our sincere condolences to Gary's family. Gary also was a leader in the tourism industry, and we now are just about out of time, and I have to throw it back over to Errol.
Okay. There's a convention in town, the National Pyrotechnics Institute. These are the people who shoot fireworks for a living, and they're meeting in New Orleans. So guess what they're going to do tonight? They're going to shoot fireworks.
Oh, good.
Okay. And so the pros tonight at 9:45 are putting on a special demonstration along the river.
What? Wonderful. We'll be looking for it. David.
Well, I was very excited about my colleague Katie Moore's piece on Unreal Estate, this guy who was running a scam where he would claimed that he was going to sell properties to people, and he didn't get it. His name was Decker Randolph, and the very next day he was arrested by JPSO, and she's going to have some follow-ups on that.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Don.
I just want to remind people that November the 8th, there's a school board election too. Now, most of the school board members are unopposed, but there are 3 districts that will have a candidate on the ballot, and I hope that people will study up on that and make a good choice.
And really use their civics.
Exactly.
Okay.
So one thing I'll be watching is there's a group of protesters going down to Jackson Square tomorrow. They're talking about tearing down the monument of President Jackson.
With ropes.
With ropes. I bet you they don't do it. I bet it's hard to tear down a monument. Remember Saddam, when he came down? They needed a crane.
Yeah.
That's right, and that's not a safe proposition to hauling a heavy monument down.
These guys don't have a crane.
All right. Thanks, you guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.